Welcome to the deep dive. We've gathered a whole stack of your material today. We're looking at everything from, online forum chats about military tech to history articles, even recent news.
Yeah, a really interesting mix.
And we're diving into the really long and kind of surprising life of heavy strategic bombers. Specifically, we're focusing on the Soviet, now Russian Tupolev Tu-95, the one NATO calls the Bear.
Right. And these planes, they're not just museum pieces, are they?
Right.
They really represent a particular approach to strategic air power that's somehow stuck around for decades.
Exactly.
And the big question that keeps coming up in this material is, are they genuinely outdated now? Or have they adapted? That's sort of the mission for this deep dive, figuring that out.
Okay, let's get into it. So first up, that core question we saw popping up on Reddit, are planes like the Tu-95 and, the B-52 too, just outdated giants today?
It's a fair question, right, when you just look at them.
Totally. The comments we saw mention the obvious things. They're huge, seem like slow-moving targets, probably not very maneuverable. It just feels like something that big shouldn't really survive modern air defenses.
And, for certain types of missions, that's probably true.
But then right away, the material pushes back. People mention the impressive bomb load they can carry and how maybe they work with newer tech.
Exactly. That nuance comes through. Like one Reddit user, Ansible, I think, pointed out, yeah, they're definitely outdated if you imagine sending them deep into contested airspace, unescorted, against a modern enemy. That's just not happening.
Okay, so if not that, then how do they stay relevant? What's the use case?
Well, the relevance seems to hinge on specific conditions. Like if you already control the skies, have air superiority, or, and this is the big one, if they're doing standoff missions.
Standoff, meaning launching weapons from far away.
Precisely. Launching missiles from hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles out. That keeps the bomber itself well clear of the most dangerous air defenses. And then the fact they can carry so much becomes a huge advantage again.
Right. Which brings us squarely to the Bear, the Tu-95. It's such an icon, and its age is just, wow.
It really is something else. First flight, 1952, entered service 56. We're talking about a design from, 70 years ago? Still flying active missions.
And one of the weirdest things about it, looking at the specs, is the engines. Turboprops, not jets, with those absolutely massive, distinctive, contra-rotating propellers.
Yeah, double propeller spinning opposite ways on each engine.
And swept wings like a jet. It's such an unusual combination.
And there's a clear reason for that choice, way back when.
Yeah.
In the early 50s, they needed a bomber that could reach the U.S. early jets. Just way too thirsty, not enough range.
Oh, okay.
So turboprops, despite being complex, gave them the endurance they needed with the tech they had then.
And speaking of quirks, the noise. Everyone mentions the noise. Apparently, it's one of the loudest military planes ever built.
Oh, yeah. That's down to those contra-rotating props again. The tips actually go supersonic. Creates this incredibly intense, unique sound. People call it a growl or a buzz.
It's so loud, the sources say. Submarine crews could sometimes hear it underwater. Even jet pilots flying nearby commented on it.
Yeah, you can imagine.
There was this great story, an anecdote from a U.S. Navy pilot in '66. Flying his F-4 near a Bear, felt the vibration from the props in his own cockpit.
Wow.
But what he also mentioned was this kind of respect, between the crews, acknowledging the skill involved on both sides, even deep in the Cold War. A real human moment.
It really sums up that era, doesn't it? The Bear became this symbol of Soviet long-range power. They needed something to reach the U.S., partly inspired, actually, by copying the American B-29 bomber earlier, which became their Tu-4.
And they really went for it. The production numbers were huge, over 500 built. That's a lot of bombers based on one design.
Absolutely. That scale tells you how important it was strategically, at least initially.
So they started out carrying bombs. Famously, one dropped the Tsar Bomba, right? The biggest nuke ever tested. A modified Tu-95.
That's the one. A terrifying demonstration.
But you said the key to them sticking around so long wasn't just dropping bombs, it was adapting.
Exactly. The absolute crucial change was turning it into a platform for launching long-range cruise missiles.
Right, back to that standoff idea. Fire from way outside enemy air defense range.
That's the ticket. It means the bomber itself stays relatively safe. And they can carry a lot of these modern missiles, things like the KH-55, the newer KH-101, KH-102, even the KH-BD is mentioned.
How many can they carry?
Modernized ones, the Tu-95 MSM, can apparently carry up to 16 missiles total, often 8 of the big KH-101s or 102s under the wings. That's a serious punch from a distance.
And the basic airframe turned out to be useful for other things, too, not just bombing or missiles. We saw mentions of, like, maritime patrol versions,
Yeah.
the Tu-142.
Yep, long-range sub-hunter.
Electronic intelligence gathering planes, even a civilian airliner, the Tu-114, and an AWACS plane, the Tu-126, all based on the Bear.
That's pretty remarkable versatility from one core design. Not many aircraft families stretch that far.
Plus, they became famous for those trolling flights, right? Flying near NATO airspace during the Cold War, and then starting it up again around 2007, just showing the flag, projecting power.
Classic Cold War signaling, yeah.
Yeah.
But interestingly, despite all that history, the sources say its first actual combat use, firing cruise missiles, wasn't until 2015 in Syria.
Which really underlines that its main combat role now is that standoff missile capability.
Pretty much, yeah.
So the big question then, how on earth does a design from the 1950s manage to stay relevant today?
Well, number one is that adaptation we talked about becoming a missile carrier. That's huge. But another factor mentioned is, believe it or not, cost.
Plus, it's cheaper to fly.
For certain missions, yes. Cheaper per flight hour than maybe some newer, more complex aircraft that could theoretically do the same standoff job. So, if it works, why replace it entirely?
It's like those classic designs that just refuse to die. We saw some funny comparisons in the source comments, people mentioning the M2 machine gun.
Still going strong after nearly a century.
The 1911 pistol, that Russian rifle cartridge, the 7.62 by 54R, someone even joked about the Mark I Heavy Rock.
Yeah, it puts the Bear's longevity in perspective. It's truly exceptional for a complex aircraft.
And unlike a Rock, it's had serious upgrades. The material detailed the Tu-95 MSM variant.
Right. This isn't just the same 1956 plane with a new coat of paint.
Sounds like major work. New radar, new navigation systems, defensive electronics, and importantly, upgraded engines. New props, too.
Exactly. The NK-12 MPM engines with those new AV60T props, they apparently cut vibration by like 50%. That's significant.
So these upgrades let it carry the modern missiles like the KH-101 effectively. They're actively keeping it current.
They are. It's still an evolving platform, which is kind of amazing.
Okay, but now the flip side, the vulnerabilities. What makes this old giant potentially risky to operate today?
Well, despite the standoff role, it's still fundamentally a big, non-stealthy aircraft. If it had to go somewhere with serious air defenses, or if it lost its standoff advantage somehow, it's a target.
Right, basic physics. Big, loud plane. Easier to spot, easier to hit if you can get to it. And the sources do mention it's had its share of accidents over the years, too.
It's a very old airframe, mechanically complex. Accidents happen over such a long service life.
But the really stark new vulnerability comes from recent events. We reviewed news reports about these large-scale Ukrainian drone attacks happened June 1st, 2025, targeting multiple Russian air bases.
Yeah, reports mention several bases hit Alenia, Belaya, Dyagzlevo, Ivanovo, Voskresensk, bases deep inside Russia.
And the damage reported was significant. Multiple Tu-95s apparently hit, damaged, or destroyed. Along with other high-value assets like A-50 radar planes and Il-76 transports, some reports claimed, over 40 aircraft hit across the board, a big chunk of the bomber force potentially affected.
It's startling. And the reported method is just as interesting. FPV drones, the small ones, supposedly launched from modified trucks, this operation called Spider's Web.
And this follows earlier attacks on key bomber bases like Engels, bases that were thought to be pretty safe, far from the fighting.
Exactly. So what this tells us, really, is that even hundreds of miles from the front lines, these large, valuable aircraft aren't necessarily safe anymore, not even on the ground.
It highlights a whole new vulnerability for these standoff platforms, ironically, when they're most vulnerable part.
It absolutely does. It forces a total rethink of airbase security in the era of cheap, long-range drones. What does safe distance even mean now?
So given this aging fleet, these new ground threats, what about replacing them? Russia's got the PAC-DA program, right?
Yes, the PAC-DA. That's supposed to be their next-generation stealth bomber. A flying wing design, sort of like the American B-21 Raider.
Been in development a while, though.
For years. Planned test flights keep getting mentioned. But the sources we looked at suggest there's a lot of uncertainty.
Why is that?
Sanctions, mainly. Access to the kind of high-end electronics and components needed for a cutting-edge stealth aircraft. It's noted that even their current missiles rely on some Western tech inside. building a whole new stealth bomber without that access. That's a huge challenge.
And meanwhile, the US B-21 seems to be moving forward.
Right, the comparison is often made. If the PAC-DA struggles badly or gets delayed indefinitely, Russia could face a real gap in its strategic bomber capability as the Tu-95s, Tu-22s, and even the newer Tu-160s continue to age.
Which could affect their status, right? Having that strategic bomber leg of the nuclear triad is a big deal for major powers.
It is. It's a symbol of global reach and power projection. Failing to field a modern replacement would, over time, diminish that aspect of their military standing.
Great.
We even saw a source mention throwing around ideas like converting cargo planes or bombing runs in low-threat areas.
Really? Like a cheap alternative.
Suggests they're at least thinking about the cost and difficulty of replacing dedicated strategic bombers, maybe looking for fallback options.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, the Tu-95 Bear. An incredibly old design, 50s tech, still flying. Its survival is down to, fundamentally, adaptation.
Right. Mainly becoming that standoff cruise missile carrier, and also finding use in things like maritime patrol.
And constant modernization has been key, too, keeping its systems relevant. But recent events, those drone attacks, show a major new vulnerability, specifically on the ground.
And the future looks kind of murky. The replacement program, PAC-DA, faces hurdles, partly due to sanctions and tech access. So Russia's future heavy bomber force seems uncertain.
Yeah, the Bear story really is fascinating. It's not just about one plane. It shows how military tech evolves, how old gear can get new life through upgrades and changing roles, but also how even things you think are secure, like strategic bombers on rear bases, can suddenly face brand new threats. Its sheer longevity compared to so many newer planes is just remarkable.
And maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Think about that paradox. Here you have one of the oldest military aircraft still in service,
Truly ancient in aviation terms.
launching some of the very newest high-tech long-range missiles. But that same ancient plane is now vulnerable to modern, relatively cheap drone tech while it's just sitting parked. What does that tell you about how warfare is changing right now? Something to chew on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.